The Alpha King wept at his daughter's grave, not knowing she was alive, watching him from the moonlit pines. The rain hammered against the cobblestones of Boston's narrow streets as Margaret Thornwood pressed herself against the cold brick wall of the alley. Her breath came in sharp, painful gasps that fogged the frigid November air. Just 3 days ago, she had been the beloved daughter of Governor Edmund Thornwood, the most powerful man in the Massachusetts colony. Now she was a ghost, watching her own funeral procession wind its way through the muddy streets toward the old cemetery on Beacon Hill. The black carriages rolled past, their wheels grinding against the wet stones. Margaret could see her father's profile through the rain-streaked window of the lead carriage. His face was carved from granite, his jaw set in that familiar way that meant he was fighting back emotion. Edmund Thornwood never cried. He was called the Alpha King by those who both feared and respected him. A man who had built an empire of trade and influence that stretched from Boston to the furthest reaches of the colonies. But even kings, Margaret thought bitterly, could be deceived. She pulled her stolen cloak tighter around her shoulders and melted back into the shadows. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was attending her own funeral as a stranger. The conspiracy had been perfect in its cruelty. Margaret's stepmother, Catherine Thornwood, had arrived in Boston 2 years earlier, a wealthy widow from Virginia with impeccable connections and a smile that could charm the angels themselves. Edmund had been alone for 8 years since Margaret's mother died of fever, and Catherine had swept into their lives like a summer storm, all silk and promises. Margaret had tried to warn her father. She'd seen the cold calculation in Catherine's eyes during their private moments, the way her stepmother's kindness evaporated when no one else was watching. But Edmund was blind to it, enchanted by Catherine's practiced grace and the prospect of no longer being alone. The plot had unfolded slowly. First came the rumors, whispered suggestions that Margaret had been seen in questionable company, that she frequented the docks after dark, that she'd been observed speaking with known criminals. Margaret had laughed at first, certain that anyone who knew her would see through such transparent lies. She'd been wrong. Catherine's companion, a man named Thomas Wickham, who served as her personal secretary, had proven to be a master forger. Documents appeared bearing Margaret's signature, arranging meetings with smugglers and pirates. Letters were discovered in her room, speaking of treasonous plots against the crown. The evidence mounted like stones on a grave, each piece carefully placed, each lie meticulously crafted. Edmund had confronted her one terrible evening in his study. The disappointment in his eyes had been worse than any punishment. He'd asked her for the truth, his voice breaking on the words, and she'd given it to him. All of it, including her accusations against Catherine. But Catherine had been there too, tears streaming down her perfect face, speaking of how she'd tried to help Margaret, how she'd covered for the girl's indiscretions, hoping she would change. The trial had been swift. In colonial Boston, the governor's authority was absolute in matters concerning his own household. Margaret had been declared guilty of treason and conspiracy. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn 3 days hence. But Margaret's maid, old Sarah Brennan, who had served the Thornwood family for 30 years, had believed her. Sarah had seen Catherine's true nature in the small hours of the morning when masks slipped. The elderly woman had risked everything, her position, her safety, perhaps her life, to help Margaret escape. The execution had gone forward as planned, but the woman who hanged in Boston Common that cold morning had been a prostitute named Anne, already dying of consumption, who Sarah had paid handsomely to take Margaret's place. The hood had concealed her face. The death had been real, and Margaret Thornwood had officially ceased to exist. Now she stood in the rain, watching the last of the funeral procession disappear up the hill. She had nowhere to go, no money beyond the few coins Sarah had pressed into her hand, no identity, no future. Everything she'd been had died on that scaffold. Margaret waited until full darkness fell before she made her way to the old cemetery. She had to see it, her own grave, the final proof of how completely she'd been erased. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soft and treacherous. She stumbled between the crooked headstones, reading names by the light of a sliver of moon that had broken through the clouds. She found it near the back, beneath a towering pine tree. The earth was still fresh and dark, unmarked by any stone. Her father hadn't even ordered a marker yet. Margaret knelt in the mud, pressing her hand against the cold ground. A sound made her freeze, the crunch of boots on wet leaves. She started to run, but a voice stopped her. "I know you're not dead." Margaret's heart seized. She turned slowly to find Thomas Wickham standing 10 feet away, his face pale in the moonlight. Catherine's secretary held no weapon, but his presence alone was a threat. If he revealed her survival, Catherine would find a way to finish what she'd started. "I saw you in the crowd," Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "During the procession. You were in the alley near Merchant Street." Margaret said nothing. Her mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. She could run, but he would call for the watch. She could try to fight, but he was larger and stronger. She stood her ground, silent and defiant. Thomas took a step closer, and Margaret saw something unexpected in his face. Not triumph, but torment. "I need to tell you something," he said. "About your stepmother. About all of this." "I already know what she is," Margaret said coldly. "A liar and a murderer." "Yes," Thomas agreed, his voice cracking. "And I helped her. God forgive me. I helped her destroy you because she promised—" He stopped, pressing his hand to his face. "It doesn't matter what she promised. I was weak and foolish, and now an innocent woman is dead because of my cowardice." Margaret watched him warily. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I can't live with it," Thomas said. He pulled something from his coat, a bundle of papers. "These are the real letters, the originals before I forged them. And this is a confession, signed by me, explaining everything. How Catherine manipulated the evidence, how I created the forgeries, all of it." He held the papers out to her, but Margaret didn't move. "Why now? Why? After everything?" "Anne," Thomas whispered. "The woman who died in your place. She was 23 years old. She had a child, a little boy named Peter. Catherine promised me she'd make sure the boy was cared for, that he'd be sent to a good home. But she lied. I found out yesterday that she had the child sent to the workhouse. A 5-year-old boy, alone and terrified, all because I was too much of a coward to stand against her." Tears were streaming down Thomas's face now. "I can't bring Anne back. I can't undo what I've done to you. But I can give you the truth. It's not enough. I know it's not enough. But it's all I have." Margaret slowly took the papers. In the moonlight, she could barely make out the words, but she recognized her own handwriting on the original letters. Innocent correspondence with school friends that had been twisted into something sinister. "What will you do now?" she asked. "I'm leaving Boston tonight," Thomas said. "I've booked passage on a ship to the Caribbean. Catherine thinks I'm handling business in Newport for a few days. By the time she realizes I'm gone, I'll be beyond her reach." He met Margaret's eyes. "You should leave too. She's dangerous in ways you don't fully understand yet. Your father is not safe either." "My father chose to believe her over me," Margaret said bitterly. "Your father was deceived by a woman who has spent her entire life perfecting the art of deception," Thomas countered. "Catherine was married 3 times before she came to Boston. All 3 husbands died in convenient accidents. All 3 left her substantially wealthier. I only learned this 2 weeks ago, and by then it was too late to save you." The implications of his words settled over Margaret like ice water. "You think she plans to kill my father?" "I think she plans to become the wealthiest widow in Massachusetts," Thomas said, "and I think she'll use any means necessary to achieve that goal." Margaret looked down at the papers in her hands, then at the fresh grave beneath the pine tree. She thought of her father, alone in his grief, blind to the viper he'd welcomed into their home. She thought of little Peter, that innocent child, suffering for the sins of adults who should have protected him. "I need to get that boy out of the workhouse," she said quietly. Thomas nodded. "I've already arranged it. My sister lives in Providence. She's expecting a child to arrive by morning coach, along with enough money to care for him until he's grown. Anne's son will be safe. And my father—" Thomas hesitated. "If you reveal yourself now, Catherine will simply claim you're an imposter. She has enough influence to make it stick. You need more than my confession. You need witnesses, evidence that can't be disputed, allies who can stand against her power." "Then I'll find them," Margaret said firmly. The girl who had been Edmund Thornwood's sheltered daughter was gone, buried in that grave beneath the pine. What remained was something harder, something forged in betrayal and loss. "I'll find a way to expose her, and I'll protect my father, even if he never knows it was me." Thomas pulled a small purse from his coat and held it out. "There's £50 here. It's all I could gather without arousing suspicion. It's not much." "It's more than I had an hour ago," Margaret said, taking the purse. The weight of it was substantial. £50 was enough to live on for months if she was careful. They stood there for a moment, two conspirators in a graveyard, both trying to atone for different sins. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "There's a boarding house on Fish Street, run by a widow named Mrs. Chen. She's Chinese, came here 20 years ago with her husband who was a merchant. She asks no questions and keeps no records. Tell her Thomas sent you. She'll give you a room and her silence." Margaret committed the name to memory. "Will I see you again?" "Not if I can help it," Thomas said with a bitter smile. "I'm a coward, Miss Thornwood. I'm running away while you're staying to fight. But perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps that's what I deserve." He turned to leave, then paused. "Your father goes to your grave every evening at dusk. He stays for exactly an hour alone. Catherine doesn't accompany him. She says the grief is too much for her delicate constitution. If you want to watch over him, that would be the time." Then he was gone, melting into the darkness between the headstones. Margaret stood alone beside her own grave, clutching the papers that proved her innocence and the money that would buy her survival. Above her, the pine tree whispered in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, church bells tolled the hour. She had been Margaret Thornwood, beloved daughter of the Alpha King of Boston. She had been executed for treason, mourned, and buried. Now she was no one, and that meant she could be anyone. The walk to Fish Street took nearly an hour. Margaret kept to the shadows, avoiding the night watch and the drunken sailors who stumbled between the taverns. Boston after dark was a different city, rough and dangerous, nothing like the genteel world she'd known. But she found she wasn't afraid. Fear was a luxury for people who had something to lose. Mrs. Chen's boarding house was a narrow building squeezed between a chandler's shop and a rope-maker's warehouse. The paint was peeling and the front steps sagged, but warm light glowed behind clean windows. Margaret knocked quietly. The woman who answered was small and ancient, her face mapped with wrinkles. Her eyes, however, were sharp as broken glass. She looked Margaret up and down, taking in the stolen cloak, the mud-stained dress, the desperate exhaustion. "Thomas sent me," Margaret said simply. "Mrs." Chen nodded once and stepped aside. The interior of the boarding house was spotlessly clean and smelled of tea and spices Margaret couldn't name. "You pay weekly in advance," Mrs. Chen said, her English accented but clear. "No visitors, no questions, no trouble. You break these rules, you leave. Understood?" "Understood." 10 shillings per week includes a room and 2 meals daily. Bathwater costs extra. Margaret counted out the money from Thomas's purse. Mrs. Chen made it disappear into the folds of her simple dress with practiced efficiency. "3rd floor, Last door on the right, Mrs. Chen said. Chamber pot under the bed, water pitcher on the stand. You need anything else? You figure it out yourself. The room was barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window that overlooked the alley. But it was clean. It was private. And it was hers. Margaret sat on the bed and finally allowed herself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. Her hands shook as she unfolded Thomas's papers and read through them carefully. The confession was detailed and damning. Thomas had outlined every step of Catherine's plot, from the initial forgeries to the manufactured evidence. He'd included dates, locations, the names of people Catherine had bribed or threatened. It was devastating testimony, if anyone would listen to it. But Thomas was right. If Margaret revealed herself now, Catherine would simply claim she was an imposter. The real Margaret Thornwood was dead and buried. Anyone claiming otherwise would be dismissed as a fraud or a madwoman. She needed more than Thomas's confession. She needed witnesses who could testify to Catherine's true nature. She needed evidence of Catherine's previous crimes. Most importantly, she needed her father to doubt his wife, to question the narrative he'd been fed. And she needed to do all of this while officially dead, without resources, without allies, without even a real name. Margaret lay back on the narrow bed and stared at the cracked ceiling. Somewhere across the city, her father was sleeping in the house where she'd grown up, believing his only child was gone forever. Catherine was sleeping beside him, already planning her next move, already calculating how to convert grief into gold. Tomorrow, Margaret decided, she would begin. She would find a way to earn money, to establish a new identity, to gather information about Catherine's past. She would watch her father from the shadows, protect him without his knowledge, and slowly, carefully, build a case against the woman who had destroyed her life. It would take time. It would require patience and cunning, and a kind of ruthlessness Margaret had never possessed before. But she had something Catherine didn't expect. The burning clarity that came from having nothing left to lose. As exhaustion finally pulled her toward sleep, Margaret's last conscious thought was of her father, kneeling beside a grave beneath a moonlit pine, mourning a daughter who was very much alive. He wept, she imagined, though she'd never actually seen Edmund Thornwood cry. The Alpha King had always been too strong for tears, too powerful to show weakness. But even kings could break, and even the dead could rise again. The morning came too soon, announced by the harsh cries of gulls and the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestones. Margaret woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was. Then, memory crashed back. The funeral, the cemetery, Thomas's confession, this tiny room that represented both her prison and her freedom. She washed her face with water from the pitcher, cold enough to make her gasp. In the small mirror above the washstand, a stranger looked back at her. Margaret's chestnut hair hung loose and tangled around her shoulders. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her face was pale, thinner than it had been just a week ago. She barely recognized herself. Good, she thought. If she didn't recognize herself, neither would anyone else. The morning meal at Mrs. Chen's was served in a common room on the first floor. 6 other boarders occupied the long table. 2 sailors who smelled of rum and seawater. A clerk with ink-stained fingers. An elderly woman who muttered to herself. And a young couple who sat close together and spoke in whispered French. No one looked at Margaret with particular interest. In a place like this, anonymity was currency. Mrs. Chen served porridge and dark bread with butter. It wasn't the refined breakfast Margaret had grown up with, but it was hot and filling. She ate slowly, listening to the conversations around her, learning the rhythms of this new world. "Looking for work?" Mrs. Chen asked as she refilled Margaret's tea. The question was casual, but the look in the old woman's eyes was shrewd. "Yes," Margaret admitted. There was no point in lying. Her money would run out eventually, and Thomas's 50 pounds had to be saved for more important things. Can you read and write? Yes. Do sums? Yes. Mrs. Chen nodded thoughtfully. Come back this afternoon. I may know something. The rest of the morning, Margaret spent walking the streets of Boston, relearning her own city as a stranger. She avoided the affluent areas where she might be recognized, instead exploring the docks, the markets, the tangled neighborhoods where immigrants and laborers lived, packed together like herrings in a barrel. She watched and listened, absorbing information, understanding for the first time how the other half of Boston actually lived. She also purchased new clothes from a second-hand dealer, simple wool dresses in dark colors, a warm shawl, sturdy shoes, the kind of clothing a working woman would wear, nothing that would draw attention or suggest any connection to the Thornwood family. When she returned to the boarding house that afternoon, Mrs. Chen was waiting for her in the small front parlor. I have a cousin, the old woman began. She runs a bookshop on School Street. Her assistant just left to get married. She needs someone who can read, write, keep accounts, and deal with customers. The pay is modest, but steady. Margaret's heart leaped. A bookshop on School Street. That was near her father's offices. Not so close as to be dangerous, but close enough that she could observe, gather information, perhaps even see him occasionally. I would be very interested. The cousin's name is Lin Wei, Mrs. Chen continued. She came from Canton 30 years ago. Like me, she values discretion. She will not ask about your past if you do good work. When should I see her? Now. I already told her you would come this afternoon. Mrs. Chen handed Margaret a folded piece of paper. Give her this. Margaret unfolded the paper and saw Chinese characters written in precise brushstrokes. What does it say? For the first time, something that might have been a smile touched Mrs. Chen's lips. It says you are trustworthy and running from something worth running from. That is all she needs to know. Lin Wei's bookshop occupied the ground floor of a 3-story building halfway down School Street. The windows displayed leather-bound volumes in English, French, and Latin, along with newspapers from London, Boston, and Philadelphia. A small bell chimed as Margaret entered. The interior was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books, their spines creating rivers of color in the afternoon light. The smell of paper, leather, and ink wrapped around Margaret like an embrace. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she felt something close to peace. You are Mrs. Chen's friend? The voice came from behind a towering stack of books. A moment later, a woman emerged. Lin Wei was perhaps 50, her black hair streaked with silver, her face round and pleasant. She wore a simple dress in dark blue, and her hands were ink-stained like those of the clerk at breakfast. Yes, ma'am. Margaret handed over the note. Lin Wei read it, her expression unchanged. Then she looked at Margaret carefully, not unkindly. Can you alphabetize? Yes. Can you deal with difficult customers politely? Yes. Can you lift heavy things and climb ladders? Margaret thought of the soft hands and delicate constitution she'd been raised to maintain. I can learn. That earned her another of those almost smiles. Good answer. Bad backs and weak arms can be strengthened. Pride and laziness cannot. Lin Wei gestured around the shop. This is my life's work. My husband and I built this business from nothing. He died 5 years ago. Now it is mine alone. I need someone I can trust. Someone who will care for these books as I do. Mrs. Chen says you are running from something. I do not need to know what. But I need to know you will show up every day, work hard, and not steal from me. I will do all of those things, Margaret said firmly. I give you my word. Lin Wei studied her for a long moment. What name should I call you? The question caught Margaret off guard. She hadn't thought about it, hadn't prepared a false identity. Her mind raced, landing on the first thing that came to her. Mary Brennan. Sarah's surname, offered in tribute to the woman who had saved her life. Very well, Mary Brennan. You start tomorrow at 7 in the morning. The pay is 15 shillings per week. You will work 6 days, Sunday off. You may read any book in the shop during slow hours, but if you damage one, you pay for it. Questions? No, ma'am. Thank you. Linway nodded and returned to her work. Mary. She had to think of herself as Mary now. Left the shop feeling something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Over the following days, Mary threw herself into her new life with desperate determination. She learned the organization of Linway's shop, memorizing the locations of hundreds of volumes. She practiced dealing with customers, most of them men who were initially surprised to find a woman who could discuss literature and philosophy as competently as any clerk. She lifted heavy crates of new arrivals until her arms ached and her soft hands blistered. She climbed ladders to dust-high shelves until her legs trembled with exhaustion. And every evening at dusk, she made her way to the cemetery on Beacon Hill. She never got too close. That would be too dangerous. But from the shelter of the pine trees that surrounded the graveyard, she could see her father's visits. Thomas had been right. Edmund Thornwood came every day as the sun set, always alone. He would stand before the unmarked grave for exactly 1 hour, sometimes reading from a small prayer book, sometimes simply standing in silence. Even from a distance, Mary could see how he had aged. New gray threaded through his dark hair. His shoulders, once so straight and strong, now curved with the weight of grief. On the 5th day, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Catherine accompanied him. Mary watched as her stepmother played the role of devoted wife, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, leaning on Edmund's arm as if she could barely stand from the sorrow. When they turned to leave, Mary saw Catherine's face clearly. She wasn't crying. She was smiling. That night, Mary sat in her small room and began writing. She filled page after page with everything she remembered about Catherine, the small inconsistencies in her stories, the moments when her mask had slipped, the names she'd mentioned of friends and family in Virginia. If Catherine had killed 3 previous husbands, there would be records. There would be people who remembered. Mary just had to find them. 2 weeks after starting work at the bookshop, Mary got her first real break. A merchant ship captain came in looking for navigation charts. While Linway helped him, Mary overheard him mention that he regularly sailed to Virginia, trading tobacco and other goods. When he came to the counter to pay, Mary kept her voice casual. "I heard you mention Virginia, Captain. Do you know Richmond well?" "Richmond, Norfolk, Williamsburg. I know them all," the captain said proudly. "Been making that run for 15 years. "I wonder if you might know a family I'm trying to locate," Mary ventured. "The Ashfords? They would have lived near Richmond about 5 years ago." Ashford had been Catherine's maiden name. Mary had heard her mention it once, early in her marriage to Edmund. The captain's eyebrows rose. "Ashford? That's a name I remember. Thomas Ashford had a daughter. Beautiful woman, but strange stories followed her." "Why do you ask?" "She married a relative of mine," Mary lied smoothly. "We've lost contact and my aunt is worried." "Well, if your aunt is smart, she'll stay worried and keep her distance," the captain said darkly. "Catherine Ashford married 3 times that I know of. First husband fell off his horse and broke his neck. Second one drowned in his own bathtub. They said he was drunk, but I knew the man, and he didn't drink. Third one had a heart attack at 35, healthy as an ox until the day he dropped dead. After that, people started talking. The local magistrate looked into it, but Catherine was gone before he could question her properly. Heard she went north." Mary's hands clenched beneath the counter. "Where could I find records of these marriages? Death certificates?" The captain shrugged. "County courthouse in Richmond, I suppose." "Why?" "Just trying to help my aunt get some peace of mind," Mary said. "Thank you, Captain. This has been very helpful." After he left, Lin Wei emerged from the back room where she'd been cataloging new arrivals. "You are looking for information on someone dangerous," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Mary hesitated, then nodded. "Someone who has hurt innocent people, and will hurt more if she's not stopped. And you plan to stop her?" "I plan to expose her," Mary corrected, "to bring the truth to light." Lin Wei was silent for a long moment. "I came to Boston because I was running from something too," she finally said. "In Canton, my family tried to force me to marry a man who beat his first wife to death. I refused. I ran. My husband found me starving on the docks and gave me food, then work, then his name. He taught me that sometimes the people who have lost everything are the ones with the most to fight for." She fixed Mary with a penetrating look. "Whatever you are doing, be careful. The powerful do not like being challenged by the powerless." "I'll be careful," Mary promised, "but I can't just walk away. Someone I care about is in danger." Lin Wei nodded slowly. "Then I will help you where I can. Information is its own form of power, and bookshops are good places to gather it." True to her word, Lin Wei became Mary's unlikely ally. The bookshop attracted educated men, lawyers, merchants, government officials, and their conversations often proved valuable. Mary learned to listen while appearing not to ask seemingly innocent questions that yielded useful answers. She discovered that several of her father's business associates had become concerned about his recent decisions, particularly his agreement to sign over control of certain shipping interests to Catherine. "Strangest thing," she heard one merchant say to another. "Thornwood was always sharp as a tack with money. Now he's making deals that don't benefit him at all. It's like he's not thinking clearly." "Grief does strange things to a man," his companion replied. "Lost his daughter, poor devil. Can't blame him for not being himself." But Mary could blame someone, and she was becoming increasingly certain that Catherine's influence over her father went beyond simple manipulation. She thought of those 3 dead husbands, all dying of seemingly natural causes. What if they hadn't been natural at all? What if Catherine had found ways to kill that appeared innocent? Poison administered slowly, causing symptoms that mimicked illness or accident. The thought terrified her, but it also galvanized her into action. She needed to get into the Thornwood house, to search Catherine's rooms, to find evidence of whatever method she was using. But how? She was dead, forgotten, her face now associated with treason and execution. She couldn't simply walk up to the door. The solution came from an unexpected source. One of the other boarders at Mrs. Chen's was the young French couple Mary had seen at breakfast her first day. She'd learned that the woman, Cecile, took in mending and sewing work to supplement her husband's meager wages as a ship's carpenter. One evening, Mary found her in the common room, her fingers flying over a delicate embroidered waistcoat. "That's beautiful work," Mary said admiringly. Cecile looked up with a smile. "Thank you. It is for Governor Thornwood's household. They have new servants who need uniforms made and old ones that need mending. The pay is very good." Mary's heart began to race. "How did you get the commission?" "Through the housekeeper, Mrs. Wilkins. She sends work to me because I am quick and careful. Sometimes she needs help with other things too, when they are short-staffed or having a large party. She knows I am discreet." An idea began to form in Mary's mind. "Cecile, would you be willing to introduce me to Mrs. Wilkins? I could use additional work, and I'm very good with a needle." Cecile studied her curiously. "You wish to work in that household? I thought you worked in the bookshop." "I do, but the pay is modest and I'm trying to save money," Mary said, which was true enough. Any additional income would help. "I will mention you to Mrs. Wilkins when I deliver these uniforms tomorrow," Cecile said. "But I warn you, it is not easy work. The new mistress of that house is very particular, very demanding. Many servants have left since she arrived. I can handle difficult employers, Mary assured her. She'd had plenty of practice in the last few weeks. 2 days later, Mary found herself standing in the kitchen of her former home, being interviewed by Mrs. Wilkins. The housekeeper was a practical woman in her 50s, who had served the Thornwood household for 20 years. She had always been kind to Margaret, had dried her tears when she was small, and praised her accomplishments as she grew. Now she looked at Mary Brennan with no recognition whatsoever, seeing only another potential servant. "Cecile speaks well of your needlework," Mrs. Wilkins said. "We need someone who can come in 3 days a week to help with mending and household linens. The pay is 6 shillings per week, and you would work from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. You would be expected to be quiet, efficient, and invisible. Mrs. Thornwood does not like to be disturbed by servants going about their duties. Can you manage that?" "Yes, ma'am," Mary said, keeping her voice level despite the storm of emotions churning inside her. She was standing in the kitchen where she'd stolen cookies as a child, where Sarah had taught her to bake bread, where her mother had planned meals and hummed old Irish songs, and no one knew who she was. "Very well. You can start Monday. Come to the servants' entrance and ask for me." As Mary left through the back garden, she paused by the rose bushes her mother had planted. They were overgrown and neglected now, the fall blooms faded and brown. Catherine, it seemed, had no interest in maintaining anything that had belonged to the previous Mrs. Thornwood. Monday morning arrived cold and gray, with a bitter wind blowing in from the harbor. Mary arrived at the servants' entrance precisely at 8, carrying a small basket with her sewing supplies. Mrs. Wilkins led her to a room on the 3rd floor, what had once been a storage space, now converted into a sewing room. "The mending is in those baskets," Mrs. Wilkins said, gesturing to 3 large wicker baskets, overflowing with linens and clothing. "Start with the household linens, then move on to the mistress's personal items. If you have questions, find me. Otherwise, work quietly and don't wander the house. Mrs. Thornwood is very particular about the servants staying in their proper places." Left alone, Mary examined her surroundings. The room was cold and dim, lit only by a small window that looked out over the street. But it was on the same floor as the family bedrooms, including the master suite where Catherine now slept beside Edmund. The room had been completely transformed. Gone were her books, her drawings, the pale blue curtains her mother had made. The walls were now painted a dark crimson, and the furniture was heavy and ornate, nothing like the simple pieces Margaret had chosen. Catherine had erased every trace of her, replacing her memory with something darker. But in her haste to redecorate, Catherine had missed something. Mary knelt by the fireplace and felt along the left side of the mantel until her fingers found the small hidden catch. A panel swung open, revealing the tiny compartment Margaret had discovered as a child. Inside was the journal she'd kept as a girl, along with a small locket that had belonged to her mother. Mary took both items, tears stinging her eyes. These fragments of her past were precious beyond measure. She tucked them into her pocket and carefully closed the secret compartment. "What are you doing in here?" Mary spun around to find Catherine standing in the doorway. For one terrible moment their eyes met, and Mary saw something flicker across her stepmother's face. Not recognition, but suspicion. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Mary said quickly, dropping into a curtsy and keeping her head bowed. "I was looking for Mrs. Wilkins. I finished with the linens and needed to know what to work on next." "Mrs. Wilkins is downstairs," Catherine said coldly. "And servants do not wander the family floors without permission. Who are you?" "Mary Brennan, ma'am. I'm the new seamstress. Mrs. Wilkins hired me to help with the mending." Catherine moved closer, her silk skirts rustling. Mary could smell her perfume, heavy and cloying, nothing like the light lavender scent her real mother had worn. "Look at me." Slowly, Mary raised her head. Catherine studied her face with unnerving intensity. Mary kept her expression neutral, subservient, nothing to distinguish her from any other working woman in Boston. "You seem familiar," Catherine said slowly. "Have we met before?" "I don't think so, ma'am. I only arrived in Boston a few weeks ago." "Where are you from?" "Providence, ma'am." The lie came easily now. Mary had created an entire fictional history for Mary Brennan, complete with details she could recite if questioned. Catherine continued to stare at her, and Mary forced herself to remain calm. If she showed fear, if she revealed any hint of her true identity, it would all be over. Finally, Catherine waved a dismissive hand. "Return to your work. And stay in the sewing room. If I find you wandering the house again, you'll be dismissed without pay. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm very sorry, ma'am." Mary fled back to the sewing room, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. That had been far too close. Catherine was suspicious now, watching for her. She would have to be extraordinarily careful. But she also had her mother's locket and her old journal. 2 pieces of proof that Margaret Thornwood had existed, had been real, had mattered. She clutched the locket in her pocket like a talisman as she returned to her mending, fingers trembling but determined. The afternoon passed without further incident. Mary worked until 4, then gathered her things and left through the servants' entrance. But as she walked away from the house, she felt eyes on her back and knew Catherine was watching from an upstairs window. That evening, back in her tiny room at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, Mary opened her old journal. The pages were filled with the innocent observations of a girl who had never known real hardship. Accounts of parties and new dresses, complaints about boring tutors, dreams of the future. That girl seemed impossibly distant now, a stranger wearing her face. But there were also entries about Catherine. Margaret had documented her suspicions, her observations, all the small warning signs she'd tried to share with her father. Reading them now, Mary could see patterns she'd missed at the time. The way Catherine had systematically isolated Edmund from old friends. The subtle ways she'd undermined Margaret's credibility. The carefully constructed web of lies and manipulation. The autumn deepened into winter, and Mary settled into a careful routine. 3 days a week, she worked at the Thornwood house, always quiet, always invisible, gradually earning the trust of the other servants. The rest of her time was spent at Linway's bookshop, where she continued to gather information and carefully cultivate connections. She learned that Catherine had begun pushing Edmund to rewrite his will, arguing that as his wife, she should be the primary beneficiary, rather than leaving his estate to various charities as he'd planned after Margaret's death. Several of Edmund's business partners had expressed concern, but none had dared question him directly. Mary also discovered that Catherine had dismissed 3 longtime servants shortly after the wedding. Sarah Brennan, the cook who had worked for the family for 30 years, and the stable master. All had been replaced with people Catherine had brought from Virginia, people loyal only to her. Most disturbing was what Mary overheard one December afternoon while mending curtains in an upstairs hallway. Catherine was in her private sitting room, the door slightly ajar, speaking with someone. Mary crept closer, barely breathing. "The old fool is already starting to feel the effects," Catherine said, her voice sharp with satisfaction. "Another month, perhaps 2, and he'll be too weak to leave his bed. The doctor will declare it a wasting illness, something brought on by grief. No one will question it. And if someone does?" The male voice was unfamiliar, rough and uneducated. "They won't. I've been very careful. The same method that worked on my previous husbands will work here. Small doses, gradually increasing, symptoms that mimic natural decline. By the time he's dead, I'll be the grieving widow, and all his wealth will be mine." Mary's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Catherine was poisoning her father. She was killing him slowly, just as she'd killed 3 men before. and Edmund had no idea that his grief over his daughter was being used to mask his murder. Mary had to act, but how? She couldn't go to the authorities. She was legally dead, and any accusation would be dismissed as the ravings of an imposter. She couldn't confront Edmund directly without revealing who she was, which would put both of them in danger. She needed concrete proof, evidence that even Catherine couldn't explain away. That night, Mary met with Mrs. Chen and Lin Wei in the boarding house's tiny parlor. She'd gradually confided in both women about her situation. Not the full truth of her identity, but enough that they understood she was trying to stop a murderer. "She's poisoning him," Mary said without preamble. "I heard her admit it. I need to find what she's using and prove it before he dies." "Poison that mimics natural illness," Lin Wei mused. "In China, there are many such poisons. Arsenic administered in small doses causes symptoms that look like wasting disease. Is there a doctor attending him?" "Dr. Harrison, the family physician. He's been treating Mr. Thornwood for what he thinks is melancholy brought on by grief." "Can you get a sample of his medicine?" Mrs. Chen asked. "If the poison is being given in his food or drink, there may be residue in the bottles." Mary nodded slowly. "I can try, but how would we test it? We'd need someone who understands chemistry, someone who could analyze it without asking too many questions." "I know someone," Lin Wei said. "A professor at Harvard who sometimes purchases rare books from me. He's brilliant and discreet. If you can get samples, I'll take them to him." The plan was dangerous and could easily fail, but it was the only option they had. Mary spent the next week watching for opportunities. She needed to access both Catherine's private rooms and Edmund's medicine cabinet. The first was nearly impossible. Catherine kept her quarters locked and the key on her person, but the medicine cabinet in Edmund's dressing room might be more accessible. Her chance came on a gray afternoon in mid-December. Catherine had gone out to visit friends, and Edmund was at his offices near the harbor. The house was quiet, most of the servants occupied with their duties. Mary slipped from the sewing room and made her way to the master suite. Edmund's dressing room was exactly as she remembered. Dark wood paneling, the faint smell of his pipe tobacco. His clothes hung with military precision. The medicine cabinet hung on the far wall. Mary opened it with trembling hands. Inside were several brown bottles, each labeled in Dr. Harrison's neat script. Laudanum for sleep, a tonic for digestion, a compound for strengthening the blood. Mary carefully poured small amounts from each bottle into the vial she'd brought, cork-sealed and wrapped in cloth to prevent breaking. She was about to close the cabinet when she heard voices in the hallway. Catherine had returned early. Mary froze, her heart hammering. She couldn't be caught here. If Catherine found her in Edmund's private rooms, there would be questions Mary couldn't answer. The voices grew closer. Mary looked around desperately and saw the door to Edmund's bedroom standing open. She slipped through it, closing the door silently behind her, and pressed herself against the wall. "I need to speak with you immediately." Catherine's voice, sharp with irritation. "What is it?" The male voice was the same one Mary had heard before, the rough one Catherine had been speaking to about the poison. "That new seamstress, Mary Brennan. Have you checked her background as I asked?" Mary's blood turned to ice. "I asked around in Providence, like you said. There's no family named Brennan that matches the description she gave. No seamstress who moved to Boston recently." "I knew it," Catherine hissed. "I knew there was something wrong about her. The way she looks at me, as if she knows something. And I found her in Margaret's old room, looking for something." "What do you want me to do?" "Follow her. Find out where she lives, who she talks to, what she's really doing here. And if she becomes a problem..." Catherine paused, and Mary heard the rustle of fabric as she moved closer. "Well, accidents happen all the time in Boston." especially to women who wander the streets alone after dark. The voices moved away, down the hall, but Mary remained frozen against the wall. Catherine suspected her, was having her investigated, had essentially just ordered her death if she posed a threat. The walls were closing in. Mary waited until the house fell silent again, then carefully made her way out through the servants' passages she'd played in as a child. She left the Thornwood house knowing she couldn't return. Her disguise as Mary Brennan, seamstress, had been compromised. Back at Mrs. Chen's, she delivered the medicine samples to Lin Wei with shaking hands. "Catherine knows something's wrong," she said. "She's having me investigated. I can't go back to the house." Lin Wei accepted the vials with calm efficiency. "Then we move quickly. I'll take these to Professor Chen tonight. If there's poison in any of them, we'll know within 2 days." 2 days might be too long, Mary said desperately. "If Catherine thinks I'm a threat, she might accelerate her plans. She might kill him before we can prove anything." "Then you need to warn him," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "You need to tell him the truth. He won't believe me. I'm dead. He saw me executed. He buried me." "Did he?" Mrs. Chen asked. "Or did he bury someone else? A man who loved his daughter as much as you say would know in his heart if she was truly gone. Give him that chance." Mary spent the night pacing her small room, wrestling with the decision. To reveal herself was to risk everything. Catherine would claim she was an imposter, would produce documents proving Margaret Thornwood's death. Edmund might believe his wife over the ghost of his daughter. But if Mary did nothing, Edmund would die, and Catherine would get away with murder once again. By dawn, she'd made her choice. The next evening, as the winter sun set early and cold, Mary went to the cemetery on Beacon Hill. She wore her own cloak, not the servant's garb she'd been hiding in. Her hair was loose the way she'd always worn it. If this was going to work, if Edmund was going to believe her, she had to look like his daughter, not like Mary Brennan. Edmund arrived precisely at dusk, as he had every evening for 3 months. Mary watched him approach the grave from her hiding place among the pines. He looked worse than when she'd last seen him, thinner, older, moving with the careful precision of someone whose strength was failing. The poison was working, slowly killing him while everyone believed his decline was from grief. Mary stepped out of the shadows. "Father." Edmund stopped mid-step. The prayer book he'd been holding slipped from his fingers and fell into the snow. For a long moment, he simply stared, his face white as the drifts around them. "No," he whispered. "No, you're not real. You're dead. I buried you." "You buried someone else," Mary said softly. "Catherine paid a dying woman to take my place. I escaped the night before my execution. I've been alive all this time, watching over you, trying to protect you." Edmund shook his head violently. "This is a cruel trick. Some scheme to extract money or... When I was 7, I fell from the oak tree in our garden and broke my arm," Mary said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "You carried me to the doctor yourself, and afterward, you bought me peppermint candies because you knew they were my favorite. You told me that brave girls who didn't cry deserved rewards." Edmund staggered slightly. Anyone could know that story. "When Mother died, you and I sat in her room for 3 days, neither of us able to leave. We read her favorite poems aloud, Donne and Herbert and Shakespeare. You said she would want to hear them one more time. On the 3rd night, you finally cried, and you told me you didn't know how to be both mother and father to me, but you would try your best." "Stop," Edmund breathed. "Please stop." "I am Margaret Elizabeth Thornwood," Mary said, walking closer. "I am your daughter. I did not commit treason. I was not a criminal. Catherine framed me because I was in her way. She's done this before, Father. She's killed 3 husbands. And now she's killing you." Edmund looked at her then. Really looked at her. Mary saw the moment recognition dawned. His eyes widened, his breath caught. "Margaret?" The word was barely a whisper. My God, it is you." Then he was moving, closing the distance between them, pulling her into his arms with a strength that belied his illness. Mary clung to him, sobbing into his coat, feeling his own tears fall into her hair. 3 months of separation, 3 months of grief and fear and loneliness, all came pouring out. "I thought I'd lost you," Edmund choked out. "I thought I'd lost you forever." "I'm here," Mary said. "I'm alive. But Father, listen to me. Catherine is poisoning you." She admitted it. I heard her. "The medicine Dr. Harrison prescribed. She's putting something in it, something that's making you sick. If we don't stop her soon, you'll die." Edmund pulled back to look at her face. "Are you certain?" "I have samples of your medicine. A professor at Harvard is testing them now. But we don't have much time. Catherine suspects something. She knows I've been working in the house. She's dangerous, Father." Edmund's jaw tightened, the old steel returning to his eyes. "Then we'll deal with her. Together. Tell me everything." They moved deeper into the shelter of the pine trees, away from the path where anyone might see them. Mary told him everything. Thomas Wickham's confession, Catherine's 3 previous husbands, the evidence she'd been gathering, the conversation she'd overheard about the poison. Edmund listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each revelation. "I was a fool," he said when she finished. "You tried to warn me and I didn't listen. I chose to believe her lies over my own daughter's truth." "She's very good at what she does," Mary said quietly. "She's had years of practice. That doesn't excuse my blindness." Edmund took both her hands in his. "Margaret, I failed you in every way that mattered. I let her destroy you. I stood by while you were accused, tried, and executed. I mourned at your grave while you were alive and suffering. How can you ever forgive me?" "Because you're my father," Mary said simply. "And because we don't have time for guilt right now. We need to act before Catherine realizes what's happening." Edmund nodded slowly, his strategic mind already working through the problem. "The evidence Thomas Wickham gave you. Do you still have it?" "Yes, his confession and the original letters before he forged them." "And the medicine samples are being tested?" "Lin Wei, the woman who owns the bookshop where I work, is taking them to a chemistry professor. We should have results tomorrow." "Good. We'll need irrefutable proof to bring charges against someone of Catherine's social standing." Edmund's face hardened. "But first, I need to protect you. If she discovers you're alive, she'll try to finish what she started. I've been careful. Not careful enough. She's already investigating you. You said so yourself. We need to move you somewhere safe until we can expose her." "No," Mary said firmly. "I'm not hiding anymore. I'm not running. We do this together, or not at all." Edmund looked at her for a long moment, and Mary saw pride mixed with fear in his eyes. "You've grown strong," he said quietly. "Stronger than I ever knew. Your mother would be so proud of you." "Then help me finish this. Help me make sure Catherine can't hurt anyone else." "I will," Edmund promised. "But we do it carefully, methodically. Catherine is clever, but she's also arrogant. She thinks I'm already half dead, too grief-stricken and ill to pose a threat. We'll use that against her." They spent the next hour planning. Edmund would continue to take his medicine, but would secretly pour most of it away, taking only enough to maintain the appearance of decline. He would increase his security, hiring guards he could trust, men who had served with him during the war, men whose loyalty was beyond question. Most importantly, he would begin quietly gathering evidence through his own network of contacts, particularly regarding Catherine's previous marriages. "There's one more thing," Mary said as they prepared to part. "There's a boy, Peter. He was 5 years old when his mother died in my place. Catherine promised to care for him, but sent him to the workhouse instead. I need to know he's safe. Where is he now? Providence, with Thomas Wickham's sister. But I have no way to verify that he's actually there, that he's being cared for. Edmund's face softened. I'll send someone I trust to check on him. And if he needs anything, care, education, a future, he'll have it. The boy's mother gave her life so you could live. The least we can do is ensure her son has every advantage. They arranged to meet again in 3 days at a safe location, a warehouse Edmund owned near the docks, used for storing goods that hadn't cleared customs yet. Few people knew about it, and those who did were employees Edmund had worked with for decades. Be careful, Edmund said as they prepared to leave separately. He pulled her close one more time. I've only just gotten you back. I can't lose you again. You won't, Mary promised. We're going to win this, Father. We're going to expose Catherine for what she is and reclaim our lives. She slipped away through the cemetery, taking a different path than the one Edmund would use. The night was cold and clear, stars brilliant overhead. For the first time in months, Mary felt something approaching hope. She wasn't alone anymore. Her father knew the truth. Together, they could defeat Catherine. But as she walked back toward Mrs. Chen's boarding house, she didn't notice the figure watching from the shadows across the street, one of Catherine's men, following at a distance, noting everywhere she went. The next day passed in agonizing slowness. Mary worked at the bookshop, trying to maintain her normal routine while her nerves jangled with anticipation. Lin Wei had promised to return with the test results by evening, but every hour felt like an eternity. Finally, as the winter sun set early and Lin Wei was preparing to close the shop, the professor arrived. He was a thin man with wild gray hair and ink-stained fingers, carrying a leather satchel that he set carefully on the counter. Miss Wei, he said, nodding to Lin Wei. I've completed the analysis you requested. The results are troubling. He pulled several papers from his satchel, covered in chemical formulas and notes that Mary couldn't decipher. 2 of the 3 samples you provided contained only the ingredients one would expect, laudanum and herbal compounds consistent with common medicines. But the 3rd sample, the one labeled as a blood-strengthening tonic, contains arsenic. Mary's hands clenched the counter. Are you certain? Absolutely certain. Arsenic trioxide, to be precise, in carefully measured doses. Not enough to kill immediately, but administered regularly over time, it would cause progressive weakness, organ failure, and eventually death. The symptoms would mimic a wasting disease, making it nearly impossible to detect without chemical analysis. Would you be willing to testify to these findings? Lin Wei asked. The professor hesitated. May I ask what this is about? Who is being poisoned? Mary exchanged a glance with Lin Wei. They'd discussed this possibility, that the professor might need to know the full story to understand the stakes. Governor Thornwood, Mary said quietly. His wife has been administering the poison, slowly killing him while everyone believes his decline is due to grief. The professor's eyes widened. Governor Thornwood? Good God. Yes, of course I'll testify. This is attempted murder. The authorities must be informed immediately. We're working on that, Mary assured him. But we need to gather all the evidence first. Catherine Thornwood is well-connected and clever. We need a case so strong she can't escape it. The professor nodded slowly. I'll prepare a formal report documenting my findings. It will be ready tomorrow. He paused, studying Mary's face. You seem very invested in this young lady. May I ask why? Because Governor Thornwood deserves justice, Mary said carefully, and because his wife has killed before, and will kill again if she's not stopped. After the professor left, Mary and Lin Wei sat in the darkening bookshop, the weight of what they'd discovered settling over them. You have proof now, Lin Wei said. Proof that will hold up in any court. Your father can bring charges. We need to move quickly, Mary said. Once Catherine realizes we have evidence, she'll try to flee. Or worse, she'll try to accelerate Edmund's death, make it look like a sudden heart attack or stroke rather than a slow decline. Then you should meet with your father tonight, not wait 3 more days. Mary nodded. She drafted a quick message asking Edmund to meet her at the warehouse immediately. One of the bookshop's delivery boys, a quick-witted 14-year-old named Jack, agreed to carry it to Edmund's office for a generous tip. An hour later, Mary stood in the cold warehouse near the docks, waiting. The space smelled of tar and spices, with crates stacked floor to ceiling creating narrow corridors. A single lantern provided light, casting long shadows that danced with every flicker of the flame. Edmund arrived precisely when expected, moving quickly despite his illness. His eyes were bright with barely contained fury when Mary showed him the professor's findings. "I want to kill her myself," he said quietly. "For what she did to you, for what she's tried to do to me, for those 3 men who died before, and God knows how many others we don't know about." "We'll stop her legally," Mary said firmly. "We'll expose her, prosecute her, and see her hanged for her crimes. But we have to be smart about it. What do you propose?" "Tomorrow you should visit Dr. Harrison. Tell him you're concerned about your medicine, that you've been experiencing unusual symptoms. Ask him to verify the compounds he prescribed. When he analyzes them, he'll discover the arsenic. He'll have to report it. And Catherine will know immediately that her plot has been discovered. Which is why we need to have everything else in place first," Mary said. "The evidence from Thomas Wickham, the records from Virginia, testimony from the professor, everything organized and ready to present. Then, when Dr. Harrison discovers the poison, we move immediately to have Catherine arrested." Edmund paced the warehouse floor, thinking. "I have contacts in Virginia who can expedite getting records from Richmond. I'll send express riders tonight. With luck, we'll have documentation of Catherine's previous marriages and the suspicious deaths of her husbands within a week. That might be too long. If she realizes something's wrong, then we'll have to be very careful to ensure she doesn't. I'll continue appearing weak and confused. I'll even make a show of signing over more control of my affairs to her. Make her think her plan is working perfectly. People who believe they're winning get careless." It was a sound strategy, but Mary couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. "What about your security? The guards you mentioned?" "Already arranged. Former soldiers, men I fought beside during the war. They're watching the house, though Catherine doesn't know it. If she tries to flee or makes any sudden moves, they'll alert me immediately." They spent another hour refining their plan, covering every contingency they could think of. Finally, as midnight approached, Edmund pulled Mary close. "Promise me you'll be careful," he said. "Promise me you won't take unnecessary risks. I've only just gotten you back. I couldn't bear to lose you again." "I promise," Mary said, "but you have to promise the same. Don't drink anything Catherine gives you directly. Don't eat food unless someone else has tasted it first. She's desperate now, and desperate people are dangerous." "I promise." Edmund kissed her forehead, just as he had when she was a child. "We'll end this soon, Margaret, and then we'll begin rebuilding what she destroyed." Mary left the warehouse through a back entrance, pulling her cloak tight against the bitter wind blowing off the harbor. The streets were nearly empty at this hour, just a few drunken sailors and the night watch making their rounds. She kept to the shadows, alert for any sign of followers. She was 3 blocks from Mrs. Chen's boarding house when she heard the footsteps behind her. Mary quickened her pace, her heart beginning to pound. The footsteps matched her speed. She turned down a narrow alley, hoping to lose whoever was following her, but the alley dead-ended in a high brick wall. "Going somewhere, Miss Brennan?" Mary spun around to find 2 men blocking the alley entrance. She recognized one of them, the rough-voiced man Catherine had been speaking to about the poison. The other was a stranger, large and brutal-looking, with a knife gleaming in his hand. Mrs. Thornwood sends her regards, the first man said with an ugly smile. She's decided you've become too curious about things that don't concern you. Time to have an unfortunate accident. Mary backed toward the wall, her mind racing. She had no weapon, no way to fight off two grown men. Screaming might bring help, but it might also bring the watch. Who would want to know why a respectable woman was wandering the docks after midnight? Either way, she'd be vulnerable while they investigated. Catherine killed 3 husbands, Mary said, buying time. She's poisoning Governor Thornwood right now. Do you really want to be accessories to murder? We're already accessories, the man said. Been helping her for months now, little too late to develop a conscience. He nodded to his companion. Make it quick, and make sure it looks like she was robbed. The man with the knife stepped forward. Mary pressed against the wall, her fingers scrabbling for anything she could use as a weapon. Her hand closed on a loose brick, but before she could pull it free, a voice rang out from the alley entrance. Step away from her, now. Edmund stood silhouetted against the street lamp, flanked by 4 large men in military coats. His voice carried absolute authority, the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Catherine's men hesitated. The rough-voiced one calculated quickly, 5 against 2, with one of the 5 being the most powerful man in Massachusetts. The odds were not favorable. This doesn't concern you, Governor, he said, trying for confidence and failing. Just a private dispute. Everything concerning my daughter concerns me, Edmund said coldly. And you've just confessed to conspiracy to murder. My men heard everything you said. The man's face went white. Your daughter's dead. This is Margaret Thornwood, Edmund interrupted. Very much alive, as you can plainly see. And you've just tried to kill her on Catherine's orders. I think a magistrate will be very interested in hearing about that. Catherine's men looked at each other, their desperation palpable. The one with the knife raised it threateningly, but before he could move, Edmund's guards had them both restrained, the knife clattering harmlessly to the cobblestones. Mary sagged against the wall, her legs trembling with reaction. Edmund hurried to her side, steadying her with gentle hands. Are you hurt? No, just frightened. How did you? I had you followed, Edmund admitted. Not because I didn't trust you, but because I knew Catherine would be watching. I wanted someone watching the watchers. He glanced at the captured men. Though I hadn't expected her to move so quickly, she must be more desperate than we realized. One of Edmund's men approached. What do you want us to do with them, sir? Take them to my warehouse, Edmund said. Lock them in the storage cellar and post guards. I'll question them properly tomorrow, and send someone to fetch the magistrate. It's time to end this. What about Catherine? Mary asked. Won't she run when these 2 don't report back? Not if we move faster. Edmund's face was grim with determination. I wanted to wait for the Virginia records, but we have enough. We have the poison evidence, Thomas Wickham's confession. Now we have 2 men who will testify that Catherine ordered your murder. That's sufficient for an arrest. They moved quickly. While Edmund's men took Catherine's henchmen to the warehouse, Edmund and Mary went to the magistrate's home. Judge William Sewall was an old friend of Edmund's, a man who had practiced law for 40 years and whose integrity was unquestioned. He listened to their story with growing horror, examined the evidence they'd gathered, and immediately agreed to issue a warrant. This is extraordinary, Judge Sewall said, looking at Mary. Miss Thornwood, I attended your funeral. I mourned you. To see you alive is nothing short of miraculous. The woman who died was named Anne, Mary said quietly. She deserves to be remembered by her true name. She gave her life so I could expose Catherine's crimes. I owe her everything. Then we'll make sure her sacrifice wasn't in vain, the judge promised. He signed the arrest warrant with a flourish. Governor Thornwood, I'll accompany you personally to execute this warrant. Mrs. Thornwood is to be taken into custody immediately on charges of attempted murder, conspiracy to murder, and fraud. They assembled quickly, the judge, Edmund, his guards, and 2 constables. Mary insisted on coming too, despite Edmund's protests. "I need to be there," she said firmly. "I need to see her face when she realizes it's over." The group moved through Boston's dark streets like an avenging army. The Thornwood house was lit from within, golden light spilling from the windows. They could see servants moving about, unaware that their mistress's world was about to collapse. Edmund opened the door with his own key. The household was in evening routine. Dinner had been served. The family was presumably in the drawing room. But Edmund led them straight upstairs to the master suite. He knocked once, then opened the door without waiting for permission. Catherine was at her dressing table, removing her jewelry. She turned with an irritated expression that froze when she saw the crowd of people in her doorway. Her eyes flicked from Edmund to the judge to the constables, then landed on Mary. All color drained from Catherine's face. "No," she whispered. "You're dead. I saw you hang. This is impossible." "The only thing impossible," Mary said, stepping forward, "is that you thought you could get away with murder?" Catherine's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with genuine shock. For once, her practiced composure had completely shattered. She looked like what she was, a woman whose carefully constructed lies had all come crashing down at once. "I don't know what you're talking about," Catherine said, her voice shaking. "Edmund, this woman is clearly disturbed. She's an imposter. Our daughter is dead." "No," Edmund said coldly. "Our daughter is standing right here. The woman you had executed was a dying prostitute you paid to take Margaret's place. And you've been systematically poisoning me ever since, just as you poisoned your 3 previous husbands." Judge Sewall stepped forward, holding up the warrant. "Mrs. Catherine Thornwood, you are under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to murder, fraud, and other crimes to be determined. You will be held in custody pending trial." They spent the afternoon planning. Margaret's vision was ambitious, a house that would serve as a refuge for women escaping dangerous situations, with funds to help them start new lives. They would offer education, job training, legal assistance. They would take in widows, abused wives, women with nowhere else to go. "We'll call it Anne's house," Margaret said, "in memory of the woman who gave her life for mine." Edmund squeezed her hand. "Your mother would love that. She always wanted to do more to help those less fortunate than ourselves." Peter, Anne's son, arrived in Boston a week later. He was a small boy with dark curls and solemn eyes, clutching the hand of Thomas Wickham's sister as she brought him to the Thornwood house. Margaret had arranged for him to live with them, to be educated and cared for, as if he were Edmund's own grandson. "Hello, Peter," Margaret said gently, kneeling to his level. "I knew your mother. She was very brave, and she loved you very much." Peter looked at her with those serious eyes. "Miss Ruth says my mama went to heaven." "She did," Margaret said, "and I promise you, I'll make sure you have the good life she wanted for you. You'll never want for anything. Not food, not shelter, not education, not love. You're part of our family now." The boy thought about this, then nodded solemnly. "Can I have a dog?" Edmund laughed, the first genuine laugh Margaret had heard from him in months. "Yes, Peter, you can have a dog." Mrs. Chen and Lin Wei attended the gathering that evening, when Margaret formally announced the founding of Anne's house. The widow's boarding house and the bookshop had been Margaret's lifeline when she had nothing, and she would never forget that. She'd asked both women to serve on the board of the new charitable organization, and both had agreed. "You could have chosen anyone," Mrs. Chen said. "Wealthy society ladies, prominent citizens. Why us?" "Because you helped me when I was no one," Margaret said simply, "when I had nothing to offer in return. You saw someone in need and extended kindness. That's exactly the spirit Anne's house needs. Your daughter has grown wise, Mrs. Chen said to Edmund. Loss and hardship have refined her into something remarkable. She was always remarkable, Edmund replied. I was just too blind to see it. Catherine was executed in March, on a gray morning when rain fell steadily from heavy clouds. Margaret didn't attend. She'd testified at the trial, had done her part to ensure justice was served. But she had no desire to watch another woman die, even one who had tried to kill her. Some ghosts needed to be laid to rest, not fed with revenge. Instead, she spent that morning at the real Anne's grave. They'd found the potter's field where the prostitute had been buried in an unmarked plot and arranged for a proper stone. Anne Catherine Morris, 1732-1755. She died, so another could live. Her courage will not be forgotten. I'm sorry, Margaret said quietly, laying flowers at the stone. I'm sorry that knowing me cost you your life. I promise I'll care for Peter as if he were my own child. And I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the gift you gave me. The wind picked up, rustling through the pine trees. Margaret imagined it was Anne's spirit, acknowledging and accepting. She sat for a long time beside that grave, thinking about sacrifice and second chances, about the strange paths that led people to heroism. June brought the official opening of Anne's house. The building Edmund had purchased was a large brick structure on the edge of Boston's better neighborhoods, respectable enough to be safe, accessible enough that those who needed help could find it. The rooms were clean and simply furnished, with space for 20 women and their children. The first residents arrived within days. A widow with 3 young children, cast out by her late husband's family. A young woman who had run away from an arranged marriage to a cruel man. 2 sisters escaping an abusive father. Each had a story. Each carried wounds both visible and invisible. And each found safety, resources, and a chance to rebuild. Margaret threw herself into the work with passionate intensity. She interviewed residents, connected them with jobs and training, fought legal battles for those who needed protection. She discovered she had a talent for organization and advocacy, for making the powerful listen to the powerless. The soft, sheltered girl she'd been would never have believed she could do such things. But Margaret Thornwood had died and been reborn, tempered by fire into something stronger. Linway's bookshop became an unofficial satellite office, with Margaret working there several days a week. They'd developed a system. Women who needed help would come to the bookshop asking for specific books that served as code words. Mary Wollstonecraft for someone escaping abuse. Robinson Crusoe for someone who needed to disappear. The Pilgrim's Progress for someone seeking religious sanctuary. Linway would then connect them with Margaret, and together they'd arrange assistance. You've built something remarkable, Linway said one afternoon as they organized new arrivals. A network of safety in a world that offers little safety to women. I had good teachers, Margaret said. You and Mrs. Chen showed me that real power isn't about wealth or social standing. It's about the courage to help others when you have no obligation to do so. By autumn, Anne's house had become well known throughout Massachusetts. Donations poured in from unexpected sources. Merchants who had lost daughters, widows who remembered their own struggles, even some of Edmund's political allies who saw value in supporting women's welfare. The organization grew, adding a second house, then a third. Edmund watched his daughter's work with pride and something like awe. You've accomplished more in 6 months than I managed in 30 years of governance, he said one evening, as they reviewed the organization's accounts. You gave me the resources to do it, Margaret pointed out. Without your support, none of this would be possible. You would have found a way, Edmund said confidently. You always do. That's your gift. You see what needs to be done and you simply do it, regardless of obstacles. Peter was growing too, settling into life as a Thornwood. He attended school with other boys his age, came home with scraped knees and elaborate stories about his adventures. He called Edmund grandfather, and Margaret Aunt Margaret, and he had indeed gotten a dog, an enthusiastic hound named Duke who followed him everywhere. One evening, as they sat in the garden watching Duke chase fireflies, Peter looked up at Margaret with those serious eyes he'd inherited from his mother. "Miss Ruth told me you knew my mama," he said, "that she did something very brave." Margaret chose her words carefully. "Your mother was one of the bravest people I've ever known. She made a choice to help someone in trouble, even though it cost her everything. Because of her, I'm alive. Because of her, Anne's house exists and helps other women. Because of her, you have a safe home and a bright future." "I wish I could remember her better," Peter said wistfully. "I mostly just remember her singing to me." "Then we'll make sure you never forget that," Margaret said. "We'll find songs she loved. We'll tell you stories about her. We'll keep her memory alive." Peter nodded, satisfied. "I think she'd like Anne's house. I think she'd be happy knowing her name helps people." "I think so too," Margaret agreed, her throat tight with emotion. The first anniversary of Margaret's resurrection came on a snowy December evening. Edmund hosted a quiet dinner at the Thornwood house, just family and the close friends who had helped bring Catherine to justice. Mrs. Chen and Lin Wei were there, along with Judge Sewall, Professor Chen, and a few of Edmund's most trusted associates. They raised glasses to toast Margaret's survival, Anne's sacrifice, and the year of rebuilding that had followed. Then Edmund stood, a folded paper in his hand. "I have an announcement," he said. "As some of you know, I've been considering retirement. I've served as governor for 15 years, and I think it's time for younger blood to take the helm. But before I step down, I wanted to make one final official act." He unfolded the paper and read, "By my authority as governor of Massachusetts, I hereby grant a full posthumous pardon to Margaret Elizabeth Thornwood for all crimes of which she was accused and convicted. Furthermore, I declare that said accusations were false, manufactured by Catherine Ashford Thornwood as part of a conspiracy to commit fraud and murder. Margaret Thornwood's name and reputation are fully restored, with all legal consequences of her false conviction nullified." Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks. She'd known the pardon was coming. Edmund had been working on it for weeks. But hearing it spoken aloud, officially and publicly, released something tight in her chest that she hadn't realized was still there. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you," Edmund corrected gently. "For not giving up. For fighting when anyone else would have fled. For turning tragedy into triumph and building something that will help countless others." The evening ended with stories and laughter, the warmth of friendship filling the house that had been so cold during Catherine's brief reign. As guests departed, expressing their wishes for the new year, Margaret stood at the window watching snow fall over Boston. Lin Wei joined her, 2 cups of tea in her hands. She offered one to Margaret. "What are you thinking about?" the older woman asked. "About how strange life is," Margaret said. "A year ago I was dead. I had nothing. No name, no family, no future. Now I have all of that and more. I have purpose. I have work that matters. I have people who depend on me." "You've come far," Lin Wei agreed. "But the journey isn't over. There are more women who need help, more battles to fight, more changes to make." "I know," Margaret said, "and I'm ready for them. Because I learned something important this year. We're stronger than we think we are. We're capable of surviving things we never imagined surviving. And when we come through the fire, we can use what we learned to help others." "Your mother would be proud," Lin Wei said, "and so would Anne." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the snow transform Boston into something clean and new. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more women seeking help, more work to be done. But tonight, Margaret allowed herself to simply exist in this moment, alive, free, and surrounded by people who loved her. The Alpha King had wept at his daughter's grave, mourning a loss that proved to be temporary. Now Edmund Thornwood smiled as he watched his daughter work. No longer a king ruling from a throne of grief, but a man rebuilding something better than what had been destroyed. And Margaret Thornwood, who had died and risen again, stood ready to face whatever came next. She'd learned that truth was stronger than lies, that justice eventually found its mark, and that even the most carefully constructed deception could be unraveled by courage and determination. In the moonlit pines of a Boston cemetery, 2 graves stood side by side. One remained empty, marked with Margaret's name and false dates. Edmund had chosen to leave it as a reminder of how close they'd come to real tragedy, of the price of trusting too easily, of the dangers that lurked behind beautiful masks. The other grave held Anne Catherine Morris, whose story would have been forgotten if not for the child she'd left behind and the woman she'd saved. But her name lived on in Anne's house, in Peter's growing years, in every woman who found shelter when she had nowhere else to turn. And on quiet evenings, when Margaret visited that cemetery to tend the flowers she'd planted, she sometimes thought she could hear whispers in the wind, voices of women who had come before, women who had survived impossible odds, women whose stories deserved to be remembered. The Alpha King had wept, but his daughter had risen. And in rising, she'd lit a beacon for others lost in darkness, showing them that even the dead could find their way back to life, that even the most broken things could be made whole again, and that sometimes the greatest strength came from having nothing left to lose.